Hey everyone, big news! I got a new bed! Yes! Finally! After such a long time of having a broken bed that was propped up by duct taped bits of cardboard, we got a new bed, which is why we've got the really quite horrific looking strobe effect on the camera. Anyway, there's enough of that. Enough of that. Let's be normal. Let's be normal for a bit. We match my shirt with the lights, or should we do something a bit different? I mean, green doesn't look great. Let's match my shirt. Let's match my shirt. Let's go a bit Sith Lordy with it. Something unusual happened. I allow my patrons and some other lucky people, if they catch me at the right time on my Twitch, to vote on the topic of some of these videos. And what I usually do is, if a topic reaches more than 50%, that's it. That's it. It's the topic. If none of them do, then we do a runoff, almost like it's a democracy. The thing that happened is that two topics ended up tied with more than 50% of the vote because I, the fool that I am, allow people to vote for more than one topic. Those topics were British housing and the British dream as a kind of counterpart to the American dream. It was pointed out to me that those two things are kind of connected, and so I'm here to explain the British dream of getting onto the so-called housing ladder and how that contributes to everything about British housing being totally fucked. The weekend after this video is published, it will be my birthday. No, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, you cheeky fucks. Feel free to guess in the comments and make sure they're flattering because I've been in a really, really good mood recently and don't need to have it be ruined by someone calling me 32 again like I was on New Year's Eve. One clue I'll give you though is that I'll become the age my parents were when they bought the house I grew up in, on a single income, in the southeast of England, in a major commuter town, with good transport links, good schools, and in a desirable suburb. What makes this even more wild to me is that my parents did this after arriving in the country only about 5 years earlier. Will I be able to match my parents' achievement, especially if I wanted to live where I grew up? They bought their house for £80,000 in the early 1990s, so maybe if prices are still like that, well, let's just take a look at prices in the area and oh my god, okay. That's pretty much exactly the house I grew up in. I even know the road it's on, but I've censored it for the sake of my parents. Yeah, so I don't think I'll be matching their achievement, which leaves me in the private rented sector, which has what I will politely call challenges of its own. I guess this video is me going through the totality of why our housing is just so bad, expensive, and who's responsible for it. And maybe how we can actually get around to fixing some of this, because I don't know if you all know this, but everyone needs a place to live, and a damp, mold-infested shoebox is not really where people should be living. The state of British housing. To really understand what's going on, I need to set the stage a little bit, because it's not just one factor that's making British housing and the market surrounding it so bad. With that caveat there, where are we today? Well, if you're around my age or younger, don't live with your parents. Not that there's anything wrong with living with your parents, because honestly, the things I'm going to talk about here are worse than living with your parents. And you happen to be fortunate enough to either live in the very specific places or get paid a lot of money or are able to commute, you probably live in private rented accommodation like this flat. That means that you pay a private landlord of some kind, whether you do it directly or through a letting agency, or whether your landlord, like mine was at one point, is technically speaking just the pile of money that you just throw more money onto. It means that a significant portion of your income is spent on housing. How much? Depending on where you are, it can be around 30% of your pre-tax income, or if you live in London, it can be as much as 35 to 45%, and that's just an average. It can, and often is, much higher for people in rented accommodation. For context, spending more than 30% of your income on housing is a sign that you might be something that people call house poor, where you're spending too much of your income on housing. To be clear, rents were already quite high in this country, and they've only really been going up as time goes on. Since 2015, they've gone up by around 16% on average, which may not feel like a lot given that we truly are in the cost of living crisis, but bear in mind that we had pretty low inflation and stagnant wages for most of that period. So for those of us in the misery of the private rental sector, housing has become a larger and larger portion of our expenditure. We'll come to the quality of that housing that we get for our 30 to 45% of our pre-tax income in a little bit. But if you're from Britain, you already know that you're not getting value for money. And if you're a renter in this country, you get quite minimal protections. This is the part where I say if your landlord is just a person and not a pile of money or a company, then you might want to look into whether they've been making mistakes, because you might be able to get a lot of your rent refunded. I'm just saying, look into it if you have the time. But those minimal protections don't offer you any real security. The UK has something known as a Section 21 eviction, or a no-fault eviction. Under normal circumstances, you can get evicted for things like not paying rent or running some sort of wild criminal enterprise out of your flat. You know, setting aside the obvious issues I have with things like rent and landlords, that is at least like an actual reason that exists, right? In the UK, you can be kicked out for no reason at any time. No need to establish fault, no need to explain yourself. This is obviously bad, but considering that some people who are privately renting might have families or want to have families, I mean, have you ever tried to plan for the future without knowing if you'll still be living in the same place in 2 months' time? It's not reasonable. Or to take the alternative, you might have been living somewhere for a long time and suddenly you have to find a new place to live. This lack of need to establish fault also has quite a chilling effect on the tenants. Look, being a landlord isn't a job. And for all the people who cry whenever there's an eviction ban about how they're being stolen from by greedy tenants, I just want to say, get a real job. I have a fucking real job. Come on. It's so easy. Insofar as being a landlord involves doing anything, though, it theoretically involves the maintenance of the property and making sure that black mold isn't taking over the brains of the people living there like some horrible Children of Men Last of Us hybrid. Really horrible British vibe that I've just created there. So what you might do if you're a particularly nasty landlord in the UK who's getting fed up with their greedy, ungrateful tenants wanting things like an unbroken bed or a shower that doesn't leak, you might decide that they're more trouble than the passive income is worth and just evict them. This is what's known as a retaliatory eviction, and it's probably one of the few times you can actually challenge Section 21 eviction, but it can be daunting for people to, you know, go through the courts and challenge that sort of thing. Plus, would you really want to rent the flat or house of a person who's that kind of dickhead? I don't know. This is a sufficiently common occurrence that there are loads of websites with a lot of advice about what you can do in case it's happening to you, but the fact that it's even made plausible is probably a good indicator that this isn't exactly a system designed to benefit renters. In fact, as I was writing the script, a new hellish angle to all this was added, which is that not paying rent is now considered antisocial behaviour and will mean you can be evicted in 2 weeks if this shit show of a government has its way. Just fucking horrible. Because if there's one group who needed more coddling and more powers under a flimsy premise, it's landlords. So you might be wondering, why is it so bad? We'll dig deeper into some reasons later on, but in 2021, only 20% of households were in private rented accommodation, and due to the nature of where houses are in the UK, they tend to concentrate in particular areas, which means they're a pretty safe constituency to ignore if, say, you were aiming for the 64% of households that were owner-occupied in elections. So private renters are very much the minority of households in the UK. Also, fun fact, if you're an owner-occupier, you spend much less of your income on housing, which might lead you to the question, well, why don't you simply buy a house? To which I'd reply,
My goodness, what an idea. Why didn't I think of that?
Sorry, I'm not being shitty about it, but it's just something I've heard before. But that does provide us a nice, smooth transition into talking about exactly why a lot of people don't simply buy a house, and why so many Brits already own their home. Remember at the start, when I said that the topic of housing was tied with the idea of doing a video about a British dream? Well, as much as Britain lacks a big vision as a culture, one thing you can find across almost all groups is the idea that owning your home and getting onto the property ladder is a thing that people really want to do. There are political reasons why this happened that we'll get to, but I just want you to think about how odd that sounds. Property ladder, like some kind of bizarre housing tycoon game. And that is kind of what happened. The existence of landlord heavily implies that there's a group of people who own second, third, and even more houses, which causes a problem. What happens if there's a cultural pressure to own your house, but no one is willing to sell the houses that they make passive income from in areas where people want to live? The solution might be, don't live where you work, commute. But have you considered that commuting is shit and I hate it? It's not necessarily the act of commuting that offends me, but one look at the public transport in most of Britain that isn't London, or the approximately 5 council areas in England that own their buses, or maybe some parts of Scotland, would have you thinking twice about that as a viable idea. So what, I have to own a car? That's just extra expense on top of a mortgage, if I could even get one. Cars don't grow on trees, and neither do mortgages. Let me explain. To get a mortgage, you need a few things. Decent credit history, fine. I'm alright in that front. A regular income, or incomes if you're buying with a partner who works. I mean, unemployment rates in the UK are low, so if you've managed to escape the gig economy, then you might be alright on that front. Then you need a deposit. This is where most people in the private rented sector are screwed. Now, this has been the subject of government intervention, which we'll get to later, because it hasn't necessarily helped, but let's just say for now that I wanted to buy that house where I grew up. I'd need to put up 5% of the asking price as a deposit, and I know it's usually 10%, I will explain why later on why that's not the case. So 5% of £625,000 is £31,250. I don't have that kind of money. Part of the reason why I don't have that kind of money is because the private rental sector charges so much for the privilege of not being homeless. I'm also screwed by the mortgage because banks, especially in the wake of certain financial crashes, tend to be a little reluctant to lend more than 4 to 4.5 times the applicant's income, which, without being too specific about my own situation, would leave me shit out of luck. Now, this is probably for the best. I mean, we shouldn't necessarily have people borrowing a massive amount more than they can reasonably pay back, because that was a pretty significant part of the 2008 financial crash. Reckless lending, speculation, awful nuclear waste-grade financial products. I mean, just watch The Big Short if you want, like, an entertaining version of that explanation. The real problem is, why is buying or renting a house, or if you're renting, you're usually renting a room in a house, so damn expensive? And what are we actually paying for when we buy or rent a house? We'll get into the issue of why in the next section, but first I wanted to look at what we're actually paying for and whether you think it's worth the cost. First things first, if you're renting, you're probably not renting a whole house on your own, or even as part of a couple. You most likely rent a room in a house share, which in your early to mid-20s, I guess can have its advantages, I suppose, but sharing communal space is a challenge, and people sometimes want their own space, and given the typical quality of housing in this country, it's not terribly likely that you have an awful lot of it. Taking rent as part of your income is incentivized in this country, so what might you try to do if you, say, owned a house and were trying to maximize the rent that you could take? You might try to split it up into several contained living units, or you might try to make as many bedrooms as possible. That's not exactly an incentive for ample living space, and while some people definitely can live in smaller spaces, it could be quite bad for you, actually. Just look at those early videos I did on this channel in my old tiny apartment that was shared with my partner. Do those videos look like the videos of someone who wasn't going through it during lockdowns 1 through 3? So if you're renting, you won't exactly have a lot of space of your own. You're probably sharing a house or a flat. On top of that, it's costing you around 1/3 of your pre-tax income if you have the fortune to not live in London. Sorry, I like London, but it's expensive to live there. That all might be okay if the housing stock was at least nice. You know, well insulated, warm, nicely maintained, that sort of thing. Well, if the existence of a group called Insulate Britain tells us anything, as well as the number of jokes I hear from my friends about their homes being damp and having mould in them, I think you might be able to guess that we're not exactly nailing it. That's kind of a surprise, because it can't just be that we're uniquely shit at building houses in the UK. I know I lean into that kind of reasoning about this country a lot, but this island, while exceedingly normal, isn't exactly known for its stable, warm weather. Like, it's not the tropics here. So we must have been building houses that were at least livable at some point, right? This is where it gets kind of tricky, because new builds, which are houses that are being built that are new, I feel like I didn't need to explain that, but I did, there you go, are absolutely shocking, as my favourite Welsh TikToker who inspects new builds likes to say. They're often poorly built, and what regulations there are, they're certainly not good enough or really fit for the challenges we're going to face as a result of climate change, or even to mitigate climate change, or perhaps a shock to the economy from a gas-rich country invading a grain-rich country, which then causes a cost of living crisis where it's basically impossible to either heat your home or eat anything. The low quality of new builds might not be such an issue, because very little of our housing stock in the UK is actually new, though they are what first-time home buyers are being directed towards, and the lack of insulation, the poor quality of the construction, and, you know, the feeling of suburban purgatory it can summon upon you, given where most of these are built, is pretty bad. I say this as someone who grew up in a classic British suburb in the south of England. Misery. Utter misery. Some good times with friends, though. Most of our housing was built before 1964. About 36% of it was built before World War II ended, including a substantial amount that was built before or during World War I. The thing about older housing is, it often wasn't insulated especially well. I mean, neither are the new builds that we're building now, so I guess we really are a return to tradition kind of country. Not to be the person with the master's degree in physics, but that's because the heating method for these houses was able to make up for the heat loss due to them being inefficient. Usually it was some kind of fireplace, a coal one that would be used to heat the room you were in. And in the time when people were willing to heat their houses that way, it worked. I mean, it's kind of a shitty and inefficient way to do it in itself, but I guess it must have worked to some extent. I'd suggest that maybe there were knock-on impacts from that, but at least you were warm, theoretically. This creates a problem, though. When we move to new forms of heating, these houses weren't designed to be heated by radiators, for example, and they're also, I will remind you, poorly insulated. So if your house is old, heating it requires a lot of energy, which I'm sure you'll have noticed is really fucking expensive right now. So this leads to a situation where we have poorly insulated houses that are expensive to heat, far too expensive for a lot of renters, which leads to things like damp and mold and conditions that actually kill people. If, in case you think I'm overstating the issue, a social landlord, which is to say a group that provides housing without the intent of profiting from it, were found to have said that mold was acceptable in the house of a refugee. This mold led to the death of their 2-year-old child. Also, I've not really covered social housing in this, and the people who are renting from social landlords, but a lot of what I talk about in terms of the conditions apply to them, even if it's meant to be cheaper and hypothetically better maintained. The thing is this: if you look at houses that are being built today, they're mostly brick block buildings with thin insulation. There's reasons for this, which we will cover, I would assume, but these aren't exactly high quality builds. Of course, that's partially down to the fact that housing is seen as an asset and they need to be built as cheaply as possible in that context, but it's also because Britain is weirdly stuck in its ways. It would also be a pretty significant omission if I didn't talk about housing as a race issue, because it is a race issue, especially in the UK. And about one of the incidents that really highlighted it. Grenfell Tower, for those not in the know, Grenfell was a high-rise tower block in Kensington. On June 14th, 2017, a fire broke out, and due to the materials used in the cladding and insulation, it ended up becoming the deadliest residential fire in the UK since World War II. 72 people died, and 70 were injured. The company that did the cladding and insulation used flammable materials due to the fact that they were cheaper, and because the residents of Grenfell were largely poorer from minority backgrounds or were immigrants of some variety. It's not an original point, but were the residents of the tower wealthy white people? I don't think that flammable, cheap cladding would have been used. In fact, the building I currently live in is suspected to have the same cladding, which is, calming in a building with so many students in it who I definitely know smoke a lot. It's fine. Everything's fine. We now have an idea, as soon as I recover from whatever that realization was, but we now have an idea of the state of British housing, and I think we can safely say that there's room for improvement, if nothing else. That leads me on to this question. How did this happen? How did this happen? When I talk about how things happen, I try very, very hard not to make it about a single person because it's unproductive, obscures more important historical and cultural context, and oh fuck it, it's Margaret Thatcher's fault and her grave is a gender-neutral toilet. Okay, alright. I've got it out of my system, I promise. The truth is that Thatcher was a bit like COVID in that she killed a lot of people and accelerated tendencies that were already in progress before she had power. So think of her as like a virus, but one that the people of Britain voted for multiple times, despite the fact that she was killing people. Thatcher is well known for a lot of things, including some of the stuff I just said. But one of the primary things is privatisation, at least the start of privatisation, if not the batshit insane experiments we run in this country today. I'm not going to get into neoliberalism because I don't want to march through the territory of a friend of mine who does much better videos about that topic specifically, and because we'll get stuck in the weeds if I go into it too much. The main thing to understand here is that while neoliberalism does need a state that is active and involved in some areas, it really doesn't want it to be involved in things like energy or healthcare or things of this nature, and most importantly for this video, housing. One of the things Thatcher is famous for is the right to buy policy, which gave social tenants the right to buy their council houses. Now, on the surface, this isn't inherently an awful thing. If you presented me the idea that people should own the houses they live in, I'd maybe think about why we so desperately want that to be the case rather than having an abundance of housing people can move freely between. But in the absence of that, I don't kind of get it. In fact, it was a bipartisan position in the UK. Both the Labour and Conservative parties saw home ownership as desirable. A decent piece of evidence for that isn't just their own words, but the fact that in post-war Britain, home ownership rose under both Conservative and Labour governments, and they didn't really do anything to stop it. And while the motivation may have been different between the two parties, especially when Thatcher engaged in her privatisation of housing, which I think is the accurate word to describe it, the result was the same. That is until we get to the rapid inflation of house prices. You see, something interesting happens when you take something like social housing and then sell it to occupiers without even thinking about replacing it. It makes housing a commodity which incentivizes policies that raises the value of housing, because your newly minted home-owning class would like their assets to appreciate, and it puts upward pressure on private rents because there are fewer social housing units that have affordable, relatively speaking, rents. So suddenly you have a situation where housing is in this wonderful sweet spot where a lot of people have positive equity. That is, they can borrow against their assets' inflated value more easily, and where housing is plausibly affordable for people who can borrow a lot of money, while market conditions are perfect for you to pay that mortgage with rent alongside a little tidy profit. This actually has become something of a problem with the recent rates rises because landlords are falling behind on their mortgages. And if banks repossess the housing, it usually means that the tenant is getting kicked out as soon as possible. So, another crisis to watch out for. But back to the main topic. Not only did this particular expansion of home ownership alongside the general program of privatization create homeowners, it created more landlords, and without tipping my hand too much, that's bad. Not just in a particular way, but that is probably the easiest way to understand it. Home ownership has been cited as a factor in the generational divide in voting and political values, though there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that if millennials actually had home ownership at a similar rate to other generations, that they wouldn't be much more right-wing. Though my gut instinct is to doubt that, but what do I know? I'm not a smart person. That's a really good thing to drop in your YouTube video where you're explaining something. I'm getting better at this. I've been doing this for more than 2 years and I'm really good. We're in this perfect storm of rising rents and rising house prices, so why is the rent part of that rising and already so high? Remember when I told you the percentage of households who are private renters? You'll notice that it's not insignificant, but it's not a majority or plurality. That doesn't create a particular incentive to deal with issues related to that. The usual way that groups get political parties to deal with their problems, which is to either be a critical mass of the electorate or just be considered actual people by the right newspapers, or to donate to a political party in such volume that you get to talk to the ham-faced leader of one of the political parties and explain what the problem is, isn't really available to renters. So they can just be ignored, which is, democracy in action. There's probably quite a significant root cause that we'll get to in a short while, but I wanted to explain the kinds of things that have been happening in the UK with regard to the private rented sector. The main thing is that the private rented sector isn't really regulated especially well. The regulations exist, but it's regulated against tenants. Landlords effectively act as border cops. They'll also now be allowed to throw you out in 2 weeks because of antisocial behaviour, such as being a bit too loud, which if you live in one of those mouldy shoeboxes I keep talking about, will result in families being evicted for being too loud because there's no sound insulation. It's not an exaggeration to say that people will have their lives ruined by this bizarre obsession with wanting people to just be miserable and quiet all the time we seem to have. There's a general refusal to regulate in favour of tenants. If you were to suggest things like rent controls, you'd be howled at by the press like you were some kind of communist. If you were to say... God, you can tell that I've had to deal with that. If you were to suggest that rented accommodation should be fit for human habitation, which would include things like the building being well maintained, or, not having mould everywhere. I keep coming back to the mould, but it's genuinely permeating through everything in some places. Well, the Parliament of Britain would vote against that multiple times. I'm not even joking, it's insane. But it did eventually push something through, but I don't think it should have been the teeth-pulling exercise that it ended up being, and also they left a pretty big loophole for landlords to be able to have an excuse not to do it, which is great. Typical, really. There's lots of reasons given for this, and it's probably a mixture of the fact that renters are a relatively powerless voting bloc, and the fact that 18% of MPs are landlords. That's 6 times as many as there are among the general population as of 2021. This isn't an issue within a single party, as tempting as it might be to point out that they're disproportionately Tories. Now, it's very controversial in the UK to point to these interests and to suggest that these interests, which MPs have declared, might influence their political actions. I'm going to be controversial. It influences their political actions, and given the way the Westminster system works, it filters up into their parties. Well, aside from the very right-wing ones which were already inclined to side with landlords anyway, which I guess by my reckoning would be all of them these days. I love democracy. So any attempt to regulate is met with refusal from the political class and fury by the press. Just going to speculate that a billionaire-owned press might have an incentive for property prices to keep going up and for rents to keep rising. I'm not saying anything specific, just observing a likely alignment. Then we have to address why the housing itself is so shit and expensive. Like, you could reasonably understand one or the other, but here you can and will have both. Truly world-beating. We've established that the issue isn't that the UK is uniquely bad at building houses. The houses were fit for purpose at one point, at least among the older housing stock, but, and this might be a recurring theme, the proliferation of landlordism has meant that we're dealing with an out-of-control expression of the profit motive. You might remember my very first videos on the channel, all the way back in February 2021. I'm in my old flat. That old flat was formed of a section of an old house. It was tiny, it was mercifully not particularly damp or anything, but it wasn't exactly great. You could hear the noise from the other flats, although most of it was the neighbour across the hall listening to, well, not listening to, but watching Star Wars very loudly. It was cramped, and to be honest, it probably drove me insane. That was a relatively good flat in the UK, by the way. People are being packed like sardines into small rooms because each person you can squeeze into a place is another bit of monthly income. And the best part is, our parliament is full of landlords who won't even make it so that you have to actually put effort into making the housing be fit for human habitation. Sorry to repeat it, I just genuinely struggle to believe that this country is real sometimes. Then let's consider new builds. I'll put a clip in of my favourite Welsh TikToker who I mentioned earlier who inspects new builds, but they have a reputation for being shit.
Check out this patching. I'd be embarrassed to hand this over. Look at that. That is absolutely shocking. That's a crime, that is.
Yeah. Every new housing development has to have a portion of affordable housing. Using the loosest possible definition of affordable, the houses are still shit, because if you can't sell them at a premium, at the premium price you'd expect to in a given area, well then you're going to want to cheap out on everything. It's also important to note that in terms of house prices and rent going up, that we don't really build houses, and we really don't build them where they're needed. This is kind of a consequence of building an economy on inflating asset prices and people going into debt. It's part of the reason why Liz Truss was basically 9/11 for the economy. Through her notoriously well thought out policy positions, she actually threatened people's ability to pay their mortgages, which, given the political incentives accelerated by Thatcher, was a choice. A powerful, brave, stupid choice. The UK has a particular type of house that you ought to want to live in. A suburban house with a garden and a drive for your car. There's nothing wrong with that per se, if you like it. Aside from the car perhaps, but that's a whole other thing, right? We're obsessed with suburban sprawl. The neighbourhood where I grew up in was huge in terms of the area it covered. Just road after road after road of identical detached houses. So if you want to live in a place like that, I don't hold it against you. I think you should be able to do so if that's what you like, for whatever reason. The proliferation of that kind of housing, though, is, unfortunately, if you like them, one of the factors causing problems for housing here. We're allergic to building up. And I'm not talking about, like, tower blocks. I'm talking about, like, 2, 3, 4-story apartment buildings that you'd see in, like, every comparable European country. Now, of course, I am perhaps partial to a good brutalist tower block, as the thumbnail might imply a little bit, but there are intermediate steps I find acceptable too. I want to take a second here just to talk about some of the specific nuances in this, because you might think that these issues just impact London and cities, and that's where these issues hit hardest. I mean, remember that statistic about how much of your income is spent on your rent? The thing is that while it's uneven, it can be uneven in quite surprising ways. Take Cornwall, for example, and the wider southwest of England. This is a region that fascinates me because it has such little rail infrastructure that it's statistically insignificant. I mean, literally, they don't bother recording the data for investment in infrastructure, like rail infrastructure there. And the truth is that it's a very poor region, and people generally don't choose to move there for the kind of work that you sort of expect people to move to places for. Yet houses are really expensive. Why? I just want to say that you'll see this same issue and confluence of being a poorer region in certain parts of Wales as well. And while Cornwall might, if you squint really hard, look a little like Italy, as surprising as I might find it and you might find it, I don't think it's like Italy, but people really like buying holiday and retirement homes in these parts of the country. And this compounds the problems we talked about earlier. Remember when I mentioned that I couldn't buy a house where I grew up? It turns out I'm not alone. And that these properties are kept empty during the miserable months in the UK, which is more or less all of them, but you know. This isn't a video about homelessness as such, but it would be a big mistake for me not to make this point. The UK has more empty properties than homeless people. There might well be an amount of nuance within that, but on the surface, that's outrageous. Alongside gentrification of core cities, all of this additional home ownership really compounds the issues that came with Thatcher deciding to pour kerosene onto a fire. I know I just kind of dismissed London just now, but it's interesting to think of how fucked the economic and cultural centre of the country actually is. If I wanted to move to London, I don't, but let's pretend, and wanted to live in a flat that was comparable to the one I live in a part of London that's comparable to where I live in the city that I currently live in, it would cost around 3 times what I pay now. I guess I should be thankful I get to work from home and that I live here. This has happened in part because London is a global city, and I don't mean that in the weird right-wing way. I mean that London does just attract a lot of global elite types, and when they're in London, they need a place to stay, you know? Now, I'd personally say to them, and to the people getting holiday homes in Wales and Cornwall, get a hotel. I can't compel them to stop buying houses or having them built for their purposes, but if they are watching, stop that, don't do that. I also want to be very explicit, because there's a tendency in the UK for some people to say stuff like, we're full, there's too many people, too many immigrants. None of the issues I've mentioned are rooted in immigration. For all the we have to take care of our own, no one who complains about the issue of immigration and tries to link it to housing has ever suggested appropriating those empty properties to house the homeless, even though we could probably do it tomorrow if we wanted. Also, we did bring everyone off the streets during the part of the pandemic where it was taken seriously, which, you know, was not a particularly long time. So, you know, it's clearly not an issue of supply so much as market conditions and an economy built on inflating asset prices. Hopefully, that gives you an idea into the how of it all, and it really is that bad. Which brings the question, if it's all so bad, surely people have responded to different parts of the problem. They have. And those responses have been interesting and varied in certain ways. But can it actually be fixed? Like, can this actually be fixed? I guess let's find out. Responses and how to fix it. We've outlined a lot of different problems, and finding a causal root is going to be a challenge. While it would be very gratifying for me to just say, treat housing as a place to live rather than a commodity, and leave it there, I think we can and probably should at least explore how these problems have been responded to by the government, both local and national, and subnational, I guess, activist groups, and people who annoy me online, my favourite group of people. Let's start with governments. We have an awful lot of them in these cursed isles. Since Thatcher, we've basically had a series of governments that fundamentally agree on housing. That prices should go up, and that the conditions that make them go up should be encouraged, and that home ownership itself should be encouraged, that housing should be privatised, and that construction of new housing should be largely out of the hands of state-backed enterprises. You should have private sector building the houses. You might look at that set of political beliefs and policy aims and at the things that I've pointed to in this video and say, a lot of these things seem mutually exclusive, and you'd be right, but it doesn't stop them from trying. While they seem intent on making things worse for renters, there have been some attempts to make home ownership more plausible than it otherwise might be. Remember earlier when I showed you that house, where I grew up, and told you how much a deposit would be? Well, it's only that much because I would be a first-time buyer. Usually you'd be expected to put up 10% of the value. It doesn't take a genius to work out that that would make the house even less of an option for me, as if it was at all possible, but still. Let's take an average house in the UK. In November 2022, that house cost £295,000. Let's suppose I'm a first-time buyer. Well, good news, the deposit is only £14,750. Let me ask you a question. Do you have £14,750 in your bank account? If you do, there's a Patreon in the description, but the odds are that you don't. Let's suppose we manage it though. We scrape it together, we maybe even get a little bit extra and we get £15,000 for the deposit. That leaves £280,000 to borrow. Now let's assume we can borrow that maximum 4.5 times household income and see what household income we would need to get a mortgage for this house. Our magic number is, drum roll please, £62,222 or thereabouts. That's the household income you'd need to buy the most average house in the UK in November 2022. And that's assuming a lot of things that definitely isn't true in most cases. I mean, even if you were earning that much. So as solutions go, trying to bridge the deposit gap ain't it. What about simply building more houses? Well, the government loves to talk about doing that, but the truth is that house building has slowed, especially when compared to the peak that we had in the late 60s. And what houses are being built have a lot of problems, that I mentioned earlier. They're poorly insulated and they're just kind of crap. The Welsh government had an interesting attempt to solve the issue of second home ownership. And yes, I do consider it an issue. Like, you should consider it an issue in the same way that, like, crime is an issue. By increasing the council tax, which is a local tax that we pay in the UK for things like the bins, the houses that are kept empty over a certain number of days, the idea is for it to be inconvenient enough that these people sell, which will hopefully depress the market for house prices, or force them to rent. So there's downward pressure on rent by more housing supply being available. At least that's the theory behind it, I would guess. I don't hate it. At least not the intent. Because it's identified one of the actual problems at the root of a lot of the housing crisis. And that is what I'll call additional home ownership. Because I'm going to tell you, a lot of these people own more than just a second home. The downside here is you're creating more landlords, and while in this case you're creating more landlords, presumably in England, even though the property's in Wales, so it maybe isn't as big a deal for the Welsh government, I'd say the creation of landlords curses us all. We need fewer, not more landlords. So I'm going to give it like a C+, I guess. I'm grading them now. A good identification of a problem. Bad big picture thinking. There's also been some political response. There was an idea floated about right to buy for private tenants once upon a time by the Labour Party. Probably more of an idea to scare landlords than anything else, but they had this crazy idea, and I want people to sit down. They suggested in the 2017 and 2019 manifestos that the government could build houses. A lot of it was via local authorities, but still. Oof. Now, this is obvious to someone who lives in a country where the government doing stuff isn't screamed at by balding men suffering from death anxiety that any attempt to do anything is communism. Here it's less obvious, so yeah, look, it's not communism. But the fact that people feel that way, even if they're being ridiculous about it, tells us something, and it's probably not a good thing. So the Labour Party 2015-2019 getting a C+ from me as well, identifying symptoms, at the very least. Building houses alone doesn't solve the underlying problems, nor would right to buy for private tenants, but understanding that there's a supply issue is a good step. A group of people who definitely understand that is a group called YIMBYs, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, which is the opposite of the hated NIMBYs. Now, when I say YIMBY, you might think of people who desperately want HS2 to be built, or who insist that wind turbines should be built on land, which is fine, I agree. But there's a sort who apply this logic to housing. To explain fully, I need to explain something called the Green Belt a little bit. The Green Belt is a designation in the UK for land that shouldn't be developed in an urbanizing fashion. So to give a very crude summary, the thing about the Green Belt is a lot of it is not especially green, and a lot of it is right next to major settlements where people want to live. Now, people don't want houses being built all over the place near them, generally, but those same people will resist any attempt to build on any of the Greenbelt. So, YIMBYs in the UK have this position, which is we want affordable housing for everyone, which is good. I like that. It then follows that they either want to convert buildings in cities into housing or build on the Greenbelt. Now, a lot of the Greenbelt isn't green, as I said, but you can build houses in a non-environmentally ruinous way. It's just that we choose not to. The trouble with the other part of the proposition is that a lot of YIMBY ideas towards housing don't really protect communities from gentrification. Remember that video about 15-minute cities I did, where one of the actually slightly valid critiques of 15-minute cities that weren't bizarre, insane QAnon conspiracy shit was that it could lead to these issues? Well, a lot of YIMBY policies don't address the actual underlying economics and politics of the housing issue, so that's a pretty glaring gap, even if it means well, mostly. There will probably be some kind of room for that kind of consequence to occur, if we just followed what they said. We also have a response in the form of renters' unions. I've mentioned them in a lot of videos by now, and given the expanded powers landlords are getting, I cannot encourage you enough to consider joining one. I've seen some wins and some good action on that front, and I think banding together to tell landlords to go fuck themselves is good, actually. So I've been quite negative about the specifics of the responses, and I'm trying to be more constructive these days. So how do we actually fix this? Well, there's always the option whose name I dare not speak. So what are some of the intermediate steps before we do that? Well, it depends on whether you want to keep the level of home ownership so relatively high compared to Britain's past. I'm kind of agnostic about it. Really, this is one of those things where I want people to be able to just live without bankrupting themselves. Part one of that is going to be seriously looking at landlordism. There isn't really a way around it. It's a bit like the sun. It's too big to ignore. It's the big thing. You might look at me like I'm a crazy person and say, wait, but you said there's not that many households in the rented sector. But if you look at the proportions of the expense of private renters, they're the ones being screwed worse by the housing crisis, so you should probably start there. This also extends to social tenants. The culture of landlordism is permeating through this country's housing issues, and there are some ways to deal with it. Let's suppose we don't want to do that to deal with it. How would we immediately make things better? Well, one thing would be to make it a requirement for all housing to actually be fit for human habitation without some grand loophole that says, well, if the tenants are the ones who fucked it up, it's not your problem, which is the current loophole. And to be honest, it's very rarely the tenants who actually cause the problems. Anyway. Another would be rent controls. Now, I know that's a controversial thing to say because people will go, well, wouldn't landlords just leave the market? And yeah, that's the fucking point. We don't want there to be landlords. And the house doesn't disappear if they just fuck off. And also, let's be honest with ourselves here. Who's stupid enough to turn off a free money tap where you basically do no work at all just because you can only raise the rent to a certain level as opposed to by like 25%? Like, who's going to turn off the free money tap? No one. You could also outright ban second home ownership, which, look, is very Democracy 2 with the extremism DLC, but it certainly moved things in the right direction. Or maybe we could just build high quality, well insulated social housing. Maybe even some that isn't just suburban sprawl. We know how to do it. It might surprise you to know, so why not simply do it? Well, you know why, because we just did a whole video about why we don't do these things, and part of it's because we're never going to have the right incentives for a government to do those sorts of things, and so our housing will probably be kept shit for a while. Now, that's a bit of a downer ending, huh? So, I guess there it is, and in the spirit of optimism, I'm going to try and wrap this up in a bit more of a positive way in the conclusion. So let's go do that right now. Conclusions. Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? I hope if you're from the UK that hasn't made you too miserable. It's actually an incredibly fixable issue, and we even have a little agency of our own to do something about it if we're private renters. So it's not all that bad. I mean, it's mostly bad, but it's not that bad. I'm trying to be more optimistic these days in these videos, which might not have come across well with this topic, but I hope my attempt to present some solutions was at least a nice step in that direction. It was a lot of pointing and yelling as usual, so, you know, before we resort to that, we have some things to think about, and ultimately, this is tied into a failed economic model that's ruining our lives across the board. It's all connected, almost as if something else was the problem. Who could say or name what it is? Hopefully, if you're in the mouldy shoeboxes that blight this country, you'll get out soon or things will improve, because the decision makers will definitely watch this video, but in the spirit of optimism, we know how to solve it, so that's great. Look, there's not much in the way of conclusions here. It is a terrible, desperate situation, and there have been responses, some of which have been actually quite interesting to look into. But ultimately, we need to have a big reckoning with landlordism and really actually get to the root cause of what's making our housing so fucking awful. Anyway, that's been the video, folks, but I'll leave you with one last thought before I go. Okay, well that video was a lot of fun to write and research. I have to thank my proofreaders, which is my partner and Mick Wright. You can find Mick's stuff down below in the description. I also want to say, if you enjoyed this video, you should like and subscribe. Man, that was smooth. I'm really glad that I'm starting to get really good at that after 2 years. But I also have to thank my patrons. Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, John N, and SMD are the top tier patrons. A special thank you to them. But if you would like a special shout out, or to get the videos, at least one video early a month, you can go to the Patreon. The lowest tier is £1. So yeah, toss us a quid if you can. Especially if you are one of those people who can afford a £15,000 deposit, which, yeah. Oof, you should definitely give me a quid if that's you. But anyway, remember to like and subscribe, all of the good stuff. There's a lot of content coming in the next couple of months, especially, and there's going to be a really, really good one on the day of the coronation. So, be on the lookout and make sure you're subscribing for that, and I'll catch you in the next one.